Thank you for taking the time to watch tonight's Bible study, and I hope that you will be blessed by it. This evening, we begin the conclusion of the current Bible study series, In Search of the Apostles. My hope throughout this somewhat long series has been that in the stories of these amazing people, that we will somehow be able to see ourselves. And I hope that we have been able to identify with these amazing but very human people and draw inspiration to follow Christ as they did. They made an impact in their world, so why can't we do the same in ours? We come now to the final apostle. We've covered the 12 plus Matthias, Mary Magdalene, and James, the brother of Jesus. But no study of the apostles would be complete without the apostle Paul. The only challenge for me, anyways, is how in the world to discuss Paul in two 15-minute lessons. Well, let's begin. Just like all the other apostles, we know very little, if anything, about their births and life story before their encounters with Jesus and their subsequent calls. And the same thing goes for Paul. To summarize what we do know and what scholars have guessed, I'll quote portions of a paragraph from N.T. Wright's massive commentary, The New Testament in Its World. All in all, Paul was raised in Tarsus, a Romanized Hellenistic city in an urban Jewish family enmeshed in diaspora Jewish life. The diaspora, if you've not heard that word, refers to how Jews were spread throughout the Roman Empire. We're talking about Jews living outside of Palestine and away from the temple. Now, Paul was a tent maker and thus part of the artisan class. Greek was probably his first language, though he certainly knew the Hebrew scriptures intimately, as well as the Septuagint. Now, if you've not heard of the Septuagint was the Greek translation of what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And that was the Bible, the Septuagint, that was the Bible that most of our New Testament writers would have been most familiar with. Paul was exposed to Greco-Roman literature, rhetoric, culture, and philosophy in both his city in general and in his education in particular. Early on, probably in his teens, he left Tarsus and trained in the Pharisaic tradition in Jerusalem. All the evidence suggests that in this ongoing debate about what it meant to be a loyal Jew, Paul aligned himself eventually with the more politically militant and religiously zealous Shemite wing of the Pharisees. Now, here's what Paul pens himself about his life before his encounter with Jesus. And this is found in Philippians chapter 3, beginning at verse 4. Paul writes, "If anyone else has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless." And I want to mention one thing before I move on to the pivotal event in Paul's life. In the book of Acts, we are told through the account of a couple of Paul's speeches that he was a Roman citizen. In the Acts 22 account, Paul says that he was born a Roman citizen. So that tells us that somehow his parents had become Roman citizens. How they did that, we don't know. But the importance of Paul's Roman citizenship plays out only in the book of Acts. Paul never claims Roman citizenship in any of his letters. But in the book of Acts, Paul's Roman citizenship allows him to enjoy certain privileges and rights, such as legal appeals, that non-citizens would not have. And these legal appeals and these privileges are the reasons that eventually he ends up in Rome. But let's get to the Damascus Road encounter. Bart Ehrman, in his book, The Triumph of Christianity, and by the way, that's a book I highly recommend if you're interested in the first 500 years of church history from an academic historian's perspective. But anyway, Dr. Ehrman argues that there were three key events that led to the spread and the success or the triumph of Christianity. The first was the belief in the resurrection of Jesus. That drove everything. Second was the conversion of Paul. And third was the conversion of Constantine. Now, when it comes to Paul's conversion, let me quote to you what Bart Ehrman writes. And I quote, "I am all too aware of the problem of hyperbole, but I nonetheless stick to my claim. Paul was not simply the most significant convert of the first few years of Christianity or the first century or of the early church. He was the most significant Christian convert of all time. One can argue that without Paul, Christian history as we know it would not have happened." Now, before reading the first of three conversion stories of Paul, let me say a word about his names, because this is a common misunderstood fact about Paul. Like many Jews living under Rome and in the diaspora, Paul had two names. He had a Hebrew or Jewish name, and he had a Greek or Roman name. Paul's Jewish name was Saul. Paul was his Roman name. And from our previous lessons in this series, we know that many of the apostles also had two names. So my point is, Paul did not have a name change like Abram did when his name was changed to Abraham, or Sarai did when her name was changed to Sarah. Paul is simply Saul's other name. We're told this in Acts chapter 13, and then after Acts 13, Paul is only called Paul. But let's get to the Damascus Road experience. Acts chapter 9, beginning at verse 1. "Meanwhile, Saul continued to breathe murderous threats against the disciples of Jesus. He had gone up to the high priest and asked for letters addressed to the synagogues in Damascus that would authorize him to arrest and take to Jerusalem any followers of the way that he could find, both women and men. As he traveled along and was approaching Damascus, a light from the sky suddenly flashed about him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' Saul asked. The voice answered, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Get up now and go into the city, where you will be told what to do.' Those traveling with him were speechless. They heard the voice, but could see no one. Saul got up from the ground, unable to see, even though his eyes were open. They had to take him by the hand and lead him into Damascus. For 3 days, he continued to be blind, during which he ate and drank nothing. Now, as I mentioned a while ago, there are 2 other accounts of Paul's conversion. One later on in the book of Acts, and then one from Paul's own pen in Galatians. None of these accounts are identical. And for time reasons, we won't go into the differences. And I'm not bothered by the stories differing from one another, because regardless of the details, like Ehrman wrote, this was the most significant conversion of all time. Here's what I think is the most important thing about Paul's conversion. And for this, I'll quote one line from N.T. Wright. You know, Paul's conversion, his encounter with Jesus, however that encounter occurred, forced Paul to, and I quote N.T. Wright now, that forced Paul to re-examine his worldview and recalibrate it at the deepest level, end of quote. The accounts of Paul's conversion, these different accounts of Paul's conversion, and how it changed his worldview leads me into the first of the lessons and takeaways and challenges from tonight's study. And it is this. This is number 1. The differing accounts should remind us to never judge another person's experience with the Lord because it isn't the same as yours. I say this because the church I was raised in, everybody's experience had to be pretty much the same. You had to have an altar call. You had to say a certain prayer. And by the way, that certain prayer, often called a sinner's prayer, is nowhere in Scripture, and it's never a theme, or it's never a part of Paul's conversion story anywhere. And in the church I grew up with, it goes on and on. If you could not tell the time or the day that the Lord saved you, then maybe it didn't happen, and on and on and on and on. Listen, people experience the Lord in different ways. Yes, some experience something dramatic and instant, but others come to faith in Christ over a period of time. Different terms are used by different churches, and even in the gospel accounts, Jesus approached people differently. And I believe that Jesus continues to do so today. Paul's experience was unique to him, just as your experience is unique to you and mine is to me. In the end, what's important is whether or not we follow Christ. And that leads us to the second lesson or takeaway. And you know, and it bounces off of N.T. Wright's quote that the Damascus Road experience forced Paul to re-examine his worldview and to recalibrate it. And one change was almost immediate. And this is just one example of this reshaping of his worldview. On the way to Damascus, Paul thought that he was doing God's will as he persecuted the Christians. Paul believed he had God's approval to kill. And unfortunately, as we know, Paul would certainly not be the last to believe such a lie. But on the Damascus Road, Paul met the Prince of Peace. He met the one who suffered violence. He met the one who had been executed. He met the one who overcame that violence through forgiveness, peacemaking, and by the resurrection from the dead. And I really like what Professor Willie James Jennings wrote in his commentary on the conversion of Paul and its after effects. He wrote this: yes, a killer was confronted and stopped in his tracks but equally powerful, the rationality for his murderous actions was shattered. There's no rationale for killing that remains intact in the presence of God. End of quote. And I would add to Professor Jennings' quote that there's no rationale for killing that remains intact in the presence of God to include any other means of violence. There's no rationale for killing, and there's no rationale for any other means of violence that remains intact in the presence of God. As Jesus revealed to us that our God is a God of peace, and followers of Jesus must be peacemakers. And that's just one example of this immediate reshaping of Paul's worldview as a result of his encounter with Jesus. So that leads to this challenge. In what ways are our worldviews changed and reshaped because we are followers of Jesus? What has changed, or what is currently changing because of your or my identification as a follower of Jesus? What's changed in our worldview? What is changing because we encountered Jesus? And tonight's final challenge is about impact. You've heard me quote Bart Ehrman's calling Paul the most significant convert in Christian history. None of us can be or will be another Paul. His story is unique to him. But let us reflect on how we can represent Christianity daily. Is there something that we can do each day that reflects the good news that we've encountered and has changed our perspectives because we encountered it? What are ways that we can live out Jesus? What are some of the ways that we can impact our world and wherever we may go daily? And it may be as something as subtle and simple as some of the things mentioned in the prayer that is associated with Francis of Assisi. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there's hatred, let us sow love. Where there's injury, pardon. Where there's discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there's despair, hope. Where there's darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. So whether it's in a grand fashion or in the most subtle of ways, in the spirit of the Apostle Paul, let us impact our world to whatever degree that we can. Until next week, when we'll conclude our look at the life and ministry of the Apostle Paul, and we'll also conclude the entire series. God's abundant grace and peace to you.